We will reconvene and get back to members' questions. Mr. Khanna is up and is recognized for 5 minutes, and he is appearing virtually, so he will be on the screen. Mr. Khanna, do we have you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to use my 5 minutes for 3 different parts. One, to follow up on the chairman's comments about the office culture article, on Mr. Gallagher on China, and hopefully on Yemen. I read the Foreign Affairs article, and they said the Pentagon should look more like Apple computers, and I was, of course, struck by that, given that I represent Apple computers and Apple Park. One of the reasons that I think the article made that point is that with technological change so fast and so rapid, we need to be adaptive. In Silicon Valley, you have startups that beat incumbents with huge, larger bank balances because they're innovative. And I guess my question for you, Secretary Austin and Chairman Milley, is do you agree that critical to leading China against China in the 21st century is having technological superiority? And have you spent time with Tim Cook and Sundar Pichai and others in Silicon Valley? And are you open to doing that?
I have spent time with the CEO of Google, and while there are parts of us that really seriously need to be more streamlined and more adaptive, which I really embrace that, I would say that the Department of Defense turning into Google is probably not something that I would envision. But I clearly...
I'm not suggesting that, Secretary Austin, but I'm suggesting that we take the best innovative parts of the culture. I think that's what the article suggests.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that.
And I would second that. Our need for innovation is critical. I think that we are an inheritor of an industrial age system that goes way back, not only the building, but the process, our programming systems, et cetera, all date back to the 50s and 60s, that sort of thing. So it does need to be updated. And I think getting some of the best practices out of not only Silicon Valley, but all the commercial best practices is definitely worthwhile. I've personally spent some time out there, and that helped when I was Chief of Staff of the Army. That helped in the concept of Army Futures Command and a few other initiatives we did. So I do think that's a very valuable use of time to go out and take a look at best practices in the commercial world and apply them to the defense industry or Defense Department.
Well, thank you, General. And if I can be of any help, let me know. And I also think tech companies have an obligation to be doing more to assist our military. So it's reciprocal. On Representative Gallagher's point, I share, of course, his concerns with China's potential invasion of Taiwan. I guess my question is, wouldn't the situation with Russia actually be a significant deterrent to China? I mean, the crushing sanctions on Putin, you've got to think, if you're Xi Jinping, that the world would be unified and China's economy would be devastated if they thought of any aggressive action. So wouldn't you say that Xi Jinping would be having second thoughts, given that he's seen President Biden rally the world and the economic impact such a move would entail?
I certainly would, and I would certainly think that he also values the economic opportunities that are present there in Western Europe.
Let me ask 2 questions, and then you can answer both, hopefully, with the time. One on Taiwan. Is there anything we can do to expedite our arms sales there? My understanding is that they've been stuck because of supply chain issues. And then the second on Yemen. Secretary Austin, one of the reasons I was strongly in support of your nomination to be the Secretary, and you've done an outstanding job, as you were an early critic of the war in Yemen. You were right. I'm encouraged by the recent ceasefire. Could you comment on what the United States will do if the Saudis violate the ceasefire, and whether we would be willing then to not provide spare parts to the Saudis if they violate it?
Well, we certainly hope that they don't violate it, and we don't have any reason to believe that they will. Again, every situation we'll have to treat on its merits there. But I think it's really a good first step, and we need to continue to encourage our allies and partners to stay focused on the right things here.
And on the Taiwan arms sales, is there anything we can do to expedite that, or why they've been slowed down?
Well, thanks. This is a point of focus for me in making sure that we're doing everything that we said we're going to do in terms of providing the ability for Taiwan to defend itself. So.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gates is recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Austin, why should American taxpayers fund lectures at the National Defense University that promote socialism as a strategy to combat China?
It's the National Defense University is an academic institution, and I don't know of any such lecture. But
well, that's surprising because it was widely reported. The National Defense University had Thomas Piketty come, and this was the title of his lecture, Responding to China, the Case for Global Justice and Democratic Socialism. So now that you know that they did this, would you agree that embracing socialism is not an effective strategy to combat China?
Well, I certainly don't agree with embracing socialism.
So that means...
I'm sorry. We're not going to do this. We're not going to let the guy say 4 words and still talk and then cut him off.
Well,
We're just not.
I control the time, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, but you also have to be fair to the witnesses.
No, but I got the answer I wanted. I have a follow-up. My follow-up question is if we don't embrace it, then I guess why did the National Defense University put out a statement? Again, this is funded by U.S. taxpayers, saying in this talk, Mr. Piketty will argue that the right answer lies in ending Western arrogance and promoting a new emancipatory and egalitarian horizon on a global scale, a new form of democratic and participatory, ecological, and post-colonial socialism. So why would we invite people we don't agree with to evangelize views and values that we don't share at the National Defense University when we should be learning strategy about how to combat our enemies and make assessments that are accurate?
And we do learn a lot about strategy and about the military and about joint force development, and so that is our focus in these institutions. I don't know what the context of this particular or content of this particular speech was.
Mr. Secretary, I've shared with you the context. The context wasn't better understand socialism so we can defeat it. The context wasn't learn about it so that we can offer countermeasures. The concept was that it's time for socialism. And the reason I know that's the context is because the lecture was pulled from a book written by Thomas Piketty entitled Time for Socialism. And I just can't help but notice.
And so your question was whether or not we...
I control the time.
Your question
was You guys
was
have been blowing a lot of calls
socialism.
lately on
the
matters of strategy,
no.
Mr. Secretary. You guys told us that Russia couldn't lose. You told us that the Taliban couldn't immediately win. And so I guess I'm wondering, what in the $773 billion that you're requesting today is going to help you make assessments that are accurate in the face of so many blown calls?
You've seen what's in our budget. You've seen how the budget matches the strategy, and so I'll let that speak for itself.
Well, I mean, I've also seen that we're behind, Mr. Secretary. We're behind in hypersonics. We failed to deter Russia. Last year,
so what do you mean we're behind in hypersonics? How do you?
Okay, who's ahead in hypersonics?
How do you make that assessment?
I don't know. I make that assessment because China is fielding hypersonic weapon systems and we are still developing them. I make that assessment because Russia actually used one. By the way, your own people brief us that we are behind and that China is winning. Are you aware of the briefings we get on hypersonics?
I am certainly aware of briefings that we provide to Congress.
But it's not just the hypersonic. It's all over the world. It's in Taiwan, where China last year flew more sorties than ever before. It's North Korea, on pace to shatter prior records, the number of missiles that they are testing. And so while everyone else in the world seems to be developing capabilities and being more strategic, we got time to embrace critical race theory at West Point, to embrace socialism at the National Defense University, to do mandatory pronoun training. Do you assess?
You know, it's again, this is the most capable, the most combat-credible force in the world. It has been, and it will be so going forward.
Not if we continue down this path.
To do that.
Not if we embrace socialism.
The fact that you're embarrassed by your country.
No. I'm embarrassed by your leadership.
I'm sorry for
I am not embarrassed for my country. I wish we were not losing to China.
I wish we were.
You know what? That is so disgraceful that you would sit here and conflate your failures with the failures of the uniformed service members. You guys said that that Russia would overrun Ukraine in 36 days. You said that the Taliban would be kept at bay for months. You totally blew those calls. And maybe we would be better at them if the National Defense University actually worked a little more on strategy and a little less on wokeism.
Has it occurred to you that Russia has not overrun Ukraine because of what we've done and our allies have done?
But that was
Have
baked
you ever
into your
even
flawed
thought about that?
assessment. That was baked into your flawed assessment. And so I saw that the Obama administration
fact that we
tried
helped
to
the
destroy
Ukrainians
our
was a
military
flawed
by
assessment?
starving it of resources, and it seems the Biden administration is trying to destroy our military by force-feeding it wokeism. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Keating is recognized for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, Mr. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you to the two of you. And I just want to say on behalf of this committee, we have a tradition of respecting the people that come before this committee in a bipartisan way. Make sure that, yes, we may have some disagreements about our policy, but all of us here are committed to our national security, committed to our service members, and certainly committed to recognizing that your leadership is a leadership across the entirety of our military, not just in terms of, and certainly not in terms of any political discourse or political party. So I just wanted to thank you, all three of you, for coming before us today. Secretary Austin, I did want to ask you, I was, as well as many others, horrified by the images that we saw coming out of Ukraine over this weekend, what we saw in Bucha. Our military has had extraordinary abilities to see where the Russian forces have been in Ukraine and where they're going. So I wanted to just ask you, do we know what Russian units were in Bucha that may have committed these atrocities?
Well, that's a thing that we continue to research, and there'll be significant effort going into matching, elements that were present with the time that these events probably occurred. But we don't know for certain, but we'll continue to research.
Well, there's another element too, where we see these units being redeployed. So certainly we want to make sure that we're dealing with the accountability of this. But also I have real fear about where these units may now be redeploying, whether or not they will conduct similar types of atrocities against Ukrainians in other parts of Ukraine. So I just ask for your attention on that as well.
Absolutely.
With these horrific attacks, we see there's redeployment of Russian forces as well. Their apparent decision to pull away from Kyiv. Secretary Blinken this weekend said, we may very well be entering a new phase in this war. I think that's something that I agree with. In my sense, it really does feel like where we're at now is different than where things were 5 to 6 weeks ago. But I wanted your thoughts on that. Does that sound right? Does this feel like a new phase in the war?
I think that's right. I think, as the Russians thought that they could very quickly move into Ukraine, capture the capital city, and install their leader of choice, and they weren't able to do that.
Yep.
And so now we see them reposturing and refocusing their main effort in the south and east. And so as they enter this phase, it will probably be a lot more deliberate. They'll be able to mass fires a lot more, and so the violence will probably go up in a notch there in terms of the types of things we've been seeing.
So on the Russian side, they are recalibrating, redeploying. Looking through your testimony to this body, you talked a lot about the need for us to be changing and adapting the ways that we operate, adapt and fortify our defense, have resilience and adaptability in terms of our defense. So with this new phase of the war, with these shifting goals that we've seen from Russia, does that give us space to reassess what the Ukrainians need? As you talk about how we may see even greater levels of violence and firepower from the Russians, does this give us that space to reassess what they need?
Yeah, I don't know if I would describe it as space. I would say that we consider the Ukrainians to be in a knife fight, and they're working hard every day. We're giving them what they need to continue to be successful, but we need to also look ahead, and we're doing that.
Well, they are in a knife fight, but they're in a fight with all sorts of different weapons being directed towards them. I guess my more direct question to you is, if this is a new phase of the war, do you feel like there is space for you and the administration to reconsider, for instance, the fighter jets and the transfer, facilitating the transfer of fighter jets to the Ukrainians? Is that something now that we're in a new phase that you would reconsider?
If you're talking about the transfer of MiGs, I mean,
Correct.
countries have the ability to do that now. And contrary to popular belief, the United States is not standing in the way of that happening.
But I agree with you on that front, but certainly, you know, the countries that we're talking about, they've expressed challenges in terms of how they transfer. They're asking for us to facilitate that. Is this a time for us to reconsider that?
Well, this is a time for us to continue to focus on those things that will be effective in this fight, and even amping up, you know, the capabilities that we provide them in terms of those things that are most effective.
Well, I'd like to work with you as we enter this new phase to figure out what exactly we can do for the Ukrainians. Thank you for all your help.
Yeah, we'll
yield
continue to do.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I have 4 questions, so I'm going to try to get through them rather quickly. My first question is on the budget. The proposed budget has military spending under inflation, which is going to necessitate cuts to F-35 production, for example. So my first question is with the overall divest to invest, and I'll ask this to General Milley. I guess the follow-on question is to Secretary Austin. But we're going to reduce our aircraft inventory by 250 and add 75 aircraft. So basically, for every 3 we're putting out, we're putting 1 in. And ships, we're reducing our ships by 24 and bringing in 9 ships. So a little better than 1 out of 3 replacement. Are we taking too much risk, General Milley?
I don't think we're taking too much risk relative to Russia and China, which is the focus of the NDS, focus of the budget. I recognize the numbers go down in both shipbuilding and in aircraft, but again, I want to focus folks' attention on the capability that is being bought versus just raw numbers. A lot of the aircraft that are coming out that are, for example, A-10s have very little utility relative to a high-end warfight against China, for example. They may be useful as a FMS article to give to other countries, but for our purposes relative to China, no. So, you know, the other systems that are divesting are recouping the monies in order to invest in capabilities that will be much more useful in the future operating environment.
Thank you. I just worry about the amount that we're divesting, but I realize some of it's going to have to happen. Secretary Austin, when I talk to the Baltic countries, I'm the Baltics co-chair for the Security Caucus. They say the most important thing to them is a permanent U.S. presence, maybe air defense. They're not too dogmatic of what type of unit. But would you commit to at least considering a permanent presence in the Baltics?
I think you know that I've just recently met with 3 ministers of defense from the Baltic region and heard their concerns, and we'll stay focused on their concerns. I heard the same thing from them, that they really value a U.S. footprint. I will tell you, I will commit to you that we'll continue to work with NATO to assess what the requirements will be going forward, and we will be a part of that solution. And you know, where appropriate, we will commit forces.
Thank you. A question concerning Ukraine. When I've worked with some of your leadership, as well as some of the Ukrainian parliamentarian members who came out to visit, we provided some very good capabilities to them. But there's one area that I keep hearing that they're lacking, and that's the ability to hit tanks and convoys behind the line of the fight. They have the materials at the line, and they have good air defenses, but to hit tanks 10, 20 miles back, can we, and there's multiple weapons that could do that. Are we committed to helping fill that niche, Mr. Secretary?
We are, and there are a number of ways you can do that. Long-range fires, we're working hard. I'm personally working to ensure that you know, we can get them as much as we possibly can. The use of UAVs have been very effective as well, so we'll continue that work.
What I hear is they have some, but not enough in that particular area of spectrum of warfare, so thank you. My final question is with Taiwan. Obviously, the day of an invasion, it's too late for deterrence. I think a strong, capable deterrence for Taiwan starts, well, hopefully 10 years ago, but clearly now after Ukraine. It seems to me they need anti-shipping missiles at a large quantity, also long-range air defense capabilities. What are we doing to make sure that deterrence is effective in Taiwan? Thank you.
Yeah, well, we continue to work to do what we've advertised, and that is to help Taiwan provide for its defense, help it defend itself. So, there are a number of things that we are looking at across the board.
when I've traveled out there, sometimes they're asking for weapons that look like our military, but it seems to me for them, they really do need the anti-amphibious capabilities and long-range air defense. Those two capabilities seem to be key to deterring China, and so I hope we're working hard in that way. But General Milley, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think those two systems are important. The other thing I think that's an important lesson to draw from Ukraine is a nation in arms. So if your opponent tries to invade you and every military-age man or woman is armed and they have a little bit of training, that can be a very effective use. And if it's a decentralized operation where there's local initiative with junior officers, et cetera. Taiwan is a very complex piece of terrain, lots of mountains, high-density urban areas in Taipei. There's a lot that the Taiwanese can do in terms
I apologize.
of
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll have to move on to the next person. Mr. Keating is back with us and is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank both the Secretary and the General for their service. Some of the greatest experts, I think, on Russia that I've talked with over the last several months in particular were people that have had long-term experience with Russia. They include high-ranking foreign officials as well. And they pointed out to me that that February 17th response by the Russian Federation to what they termed the bilateral treaty and security guarantees that they had wanted was critical to come back to. In that response, they required a U.S. withdrawal of all military personnel, and as well as a ban on armaments and related agreements. They cited in particular as red lines the CEE countries, Central and Eastern Europe, and the SEE countries, Southeastern Europe, including 12 NATO nations. I think it underscores the fact that this is much larger than a Russian-Ukraine conflict. So when I look at this commitment, what I'd like to ask perhaps General Milley is, what is the time frame you foresee, given that kind of understanding of the way Russia thinks and acts? Could it be something as long as a decade or even longer that we're involved in this type of conflict?
That's hard to tell. It's a bit early still, even though we're a month plus into the war. There is much of the ground war left in Ukraine. But I do think this is a very protracted conflict. And I think it's at least measured in years. I don't know about decade, but at least years for sure. This is a very extended conflict that Russia has initiated. And I think that NATO, the United States, Ukraine, and all of the allies and partners that are supporting Ukraine are going to be involved in this for quite some time.
Yeah, Secretary Austin, could you reflect on this as well? You know, the fact that the breadth of what their requests are and their demands are, how's that reflected in our policy? Because indeed, this is far more expansive than just Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, the asks were, and I agree with you, they were very extensive. Having said that, you know, and much of that we couldn't possibly do. But having said that, we're going to always look, when we're negotiating with countries, we're going to always look for things where we can find common agreement and work from that, build from that. So you are correct that that initial tranche of demands, for lack of a better term, was something that was not acceptable to Ukraine, most importantly, and to NATO and to us. So.
Also, I mean, what could we do in terms of policy for our partners right now? Two examples are Georgia and Finland that aren't NATO countries. What can we do to help support their concerns with the Russian aggression that's taking place?
Well, we can do a lot. We can do more of what we're doing in terms of. You heard us talk earlier about our engagement in helping them build their forces, and as they look to acquire different types of equipment to defend themselves, we can do that as well. And I know that you know there are aspiring countries who aspire to be part of NATO, and NATO should continue to engage them.
Given the fact there's 1 minute left, I'd just like to ask you to amplify, if you could, some of your comments you made in the opening about undersea warfare and research, making sure we have the proper investments in that regard. What do you see as the specific threats, and how can we address them in about 46 seconds?
Well, I think the threats continue to evolve. China does have substantial capability undersea, but Russia does as well. And so we want to make sure that as we look across the landscape, we're able to meet any emerging threat.
Great. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Banks is recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Austin, the New York Times this morning reported the daily average for COVID-19 cases in the U.S. is at 27,573, much less than the 0.0001% of the total U.S. population. With COVID cases at all-time lows, why are we still enforcing the COVID vaccine mandate on our military personnel?
We've seen variants of this virus, wane and then grow again, and so this is a medical readiness requirement, and it will remain so.
General Milley, during a moment of increased action from Russia to China, is it worth it? Is it worth sacrificing our end strength for vaccine mandates? Would you rather have a few extra battalions of unvaccinated soldiers or not have them at all because of this?
Thanks, Congressman. I don't think it's an either or. I think we're an organization that requires, and you're a veteran yourself, we get a lot of vaccinations. Anthrax is very, very low out there, and we still get anthrax vaccinations and so on. So I think getting vaccinated is part of the readiness issue of the health of the force. The numbers are very low, by the way, of those that are refusing to be vaccinated, and they're even lower. I mean, it's tiny, the numbers that are actually being asked to process out. So I think it's manageable, and I think that I'd prefer that everybody just go ahead and get vaccinated.
According to a CNN article on January 18th, the Army National Guard missed its goal by over 8,000, adding only 34,658 recruits for FY21.
Right.
The 2023 defense budget request just released by the administration reduces the size of the Army by 12,000 soldiers. Is the Army cutting their numbers because they know they can't recruit enough people to meet their quotas?
I've talked to General McConnell about it a couple of different times. I think two major factors. One is the population at large, those that are eligible to enter the military. Those numbers are actually pretty low. So that's one point. It's the accessions challenge that's out there in recruiting on an annual basis. The second piece is that they want to reduce manpower in order to save the money and recoup that into modernization efforts. Those are the two fundamental reasons that the Army is doing what they're doing.
General, is it a coincidence that the Army is moving forward with now involuntarily separating our soldiers and then offering a new $50,000 signing bonus to recruits who want to join the Army? And how much additional cost are we going to incur because of the increased recruiting bonuses to combat projected losses for unvaccinated military personnel?
I'd have to get back to you on a cost analysis in terms of the actual dollars relative to the bonus. You mentioned the $50,000 bonus. But again, I'd go back to, I checked with General McConnell just yesterday. The numbers are actually being compelled to depart the military is very, very small in the Army. And I think it's likewise in the other services as well. There is a recruiting challenge, though, for the Army. The other services are meeting their recruiting goals. They're on glide path for this fiscal year, but the Army is challenged, both Guard and active.
General Milley, on March 18th, the U.S. Army discharged 3 soldiers, the first time it has booted troops for failing to comply with the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. It's projected that 2,692 soldiers, the size of a couple of Army battalions, have not taken the vaccine and will likely be separated from the Army. Once again, how is this loss of personnel going to hurt the overall end strength of the Army?
I think if 2,000 are kicked out, I think that would hurt. But I think there's an issue of education here and persuasion. And making sure that these soldiers are making informed decisions.
As of March 3rd, Army commanders have relieved a total of 6 regular Army leaders, including 2 battalion commanders, and issued 3,183 general officer written reprimands to regular Army soldiers for not taking the vaccination. How has this loss of leadership and focus on administrative burdens, improved Army warfighting readiness, and enhanced combat power?
Well, again, Congressman, I think that the idea of the health of the force, the readiness of the force, and getting a vaccination is a contributing factor to that, I think is fundamental to the overall readiness of the force. So I regret that commanders are getting relief for things like that. I didn't know the numbers that you mentioned. I'll go back to the Army and get the actual data. But we are an institution that has a sole set of requirements in terms of the health of the force and shots and et cetera. And there's a policy, and our job is to enforce the policy.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Crow is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for coming in for your service to the country. Real quick, under the prior administration, they made a decision to move Space Command from Colorado to Alabama, and there's significant allegations of improper process. The GAO and DoD IG are conducting reviews of that process, and if either of those reviews find that the process was not credible, will the department commit to revisiting that process and starting it over and doing it in a fair and transparent way?
If there have been things that were improperly or illegally done, then certainly we'll revisit that. So.
Next, on the Ukraine front, a bunch of my colleagues have already talked about Ukraine and the evolution of support, but can you just very briefly, Mr. Secretary, talk about how should our support evolve as this goes from a short-term fight, us providing things that are needed and can be used now on the battlefield, to transitioning to a longer-term fight, like the National Security Advisor indicated yesterday? How does that change the nature of our support?
Yeah, I believe that what Mr. Sullivan was describing was this fight that's going to take place in the south and east of the country. And it will take, as he described it, probably weeks for that to play out versus days. And so we continue to look at what we think, and we don't think we know the Ukrainians will need, because we're talking to them on a daily basis. And it'll be a lot of the same things that we provided already, but we look for things that also can provide them an advantage in this fight. And you've seen us begin to deploy some of those things.
Well, we appreciate your work very much. We know this has been a Herculean effort by the men and women of the military and the administration, the department, and I thank you for that effort because it is saving lives. You know, this committee does have a long tradition of bipartisanship. There are people that have served, many people have served in uniform, but there are a very small handful of folks that don't understand service, that don't understand sacrifice, that attack and malign you and your service, somebody who has dedicated your entire life to service, who sometimes will compare our military to other militaries, call us woke, make up these contrived boogeymans of socialism or pull out lectures at universities. But I have known you for some time now, and I've seen the pride that you take in our servicemen and women, and the pride that you take in this work, and how you've put your entire life focused on this. So could you just take, with the 2 minutes remaining, could you just paint a picture for this committee and for the American people about what makes you most proud of the men and women of our military, and what life is like on a daily basis for the men and women that you lead?
Thanks. As you've heard me say a number of times, you know, my focus 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is on defending this country. And I'm proud to be able to serve alongside the men and women who occupy our ranks. They are committed to this, and I've been with them, you know, most recently in Poland, in other Baltic states, and in other Eastern flank countries. I've been with them in the Indo-Pacific. They are all focused on the task at hand, training, being ready to perform their missions, and all of those missions contribute to the defense of this country and protecting our interests. And I just got to tell you, I am incredibly proud of them. Day in and day out, they volunteer to do incredible things on behalf of this country. And we owe them a debt of gratitude that we can probably never repay. We owe their families a debt of gratitude as well. But they are smart, they are fit, they are focused, and they spend 99% of their time focused on defending this country and developing additional capabilities that they'll need to be successful on the battlefield. So any notion that they're woke or that our military is woke, you know, I take issue with that, and because it's just not true. It's a false narrative, and they deserve better than that.
I couldn't agree more. They do deserve better than that, and they're getting better than that. And your leadership, and frankly, the leadership and the focus of most people on this committee who take this work seriously, who are engaged in very difficult policy discussions and know the threats that we face. I appreciate your leadership, Chairman Milley's leadership, and Mr. McCord. You are more appreciated than this hearing probably indicates, but we appreciate your work as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bergman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of my colleagues asked General Milley that you would commit to ensuring that the Gold Star family criteria remain the same, and I believe I heard you say yes.
I am very committed to that.
Okay, Secretary Austin, I'd like to hear it from you.
Yes. Yes.
Very good. That is probably one of the most solemn duties that we have, is to appropriately honor not only the men and women who die in service of our country in combat, but also their families as well. Let's talk a little bit about recruiting. General Milley, you opened up your statement, and I think accurately so, by saying we have the best led, best trained, best equipped, et cetera, military in the world. Do we have the best recruited military in your estimation?
The best recruited?
Yeah.
I think all militaries are a reflection of the societies they come from. And we have a particularly challenging recruiting environment. As a former Chief of Staff of the Army, that was true then, and it's true now, and it's been true for quite a long time. In terms of the military has very high standards to get in. Unfortunately, the amount of eligible military age men and women have gone down in terms of the standards over time. So I think we're in a very challenging recruiting environment, but I do think those that do get in are the finest and the best, and I do think that we recruit the best of our society.
So we've got roughly 70% who are ineligible for various reasons. So we've already knocked that down to 30%. Has the Department of Defense spent any, I guess, research dollars to determine what is going to be the propensity of that remaining 30% to serve, to get involved, to at whatever level? I mean, is there any data being that you guys are accumulating to enable us to better?
There is. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of research that goes into that very question, propensity to serve. We can get you that. I don't have it at my fingertips. We can get you the actual data. Each of the services do.
Yeah, well, this committee, is bipartisan, and I don't think there's a one of us that sit in here that don't want to see the men and women who are eligible to serve get the right message so that they will get over that hump, if you will, of why or why not. And you mentioned that this year the Army and the Guard is not going to meet their recruiting numbers. Now, is that Air Guard or Army Guard, or both Guards?
Army Guard.
Okay.
Air Force, Marines, and Navy are meeting their goals right now. Army is not, both active Army and Guard. Okay.
So if we're just talking about the Army and the Army Guard not meeting their end strength, is there any plan, have you asked any of the other services who are meeting theirs, maybe up it? If they're meeting their goals, do they have room for more? Are we looking at increased capabilities? I'm not sure what's going on with the Army and the Army Guard, but do we have people waiting in line to sign up for the Air Force or the Navy or the Marine Corps?
The Navy is actually, I think it's the Navy, is actually at 102% on glide path, so they're actually over their objectives. Air Force and Marines are meeting their objectives. And Army is about, I want to say it's about 10 to 15 points below the objective right now. Now, the year's not over. The year's young. We're 4 months into the year. Typically, this data will change very significantly upon high school graduation, come June, July timeframe. And that's the big months at which there's a big, huge data correction. What the Army is projecting over time is they'll come in at a few percentage points below objective for the year. as opposed
Are
to.
we sacrificing any quality to make those
No,
year-end
that's
numbers?
no, not at all, Congressman.
Okay.
What they're doing is ensuring that they're enforcing the quality of the force coming in.
Okay, and just for the sake of discussion here, we know we have a significant number of men and women who are no longer in service because of their refusal to take the COVID vaccine. If, for whatever reason, any or all of them decided they wanted to reaffiliate with the service, would they be given an option?
I'd have to get with each of the service chiefs in terms of the policies inside the service, but if someone wants to get the shot and come on back in, I don't.
Well, we've got millions and millions and millions of dollars of training for
Sure,
those people that we forced out, and
If
we're
you want to
short.
comply with the rules and regulation, I
Chairman's
personally.
time has expired.
Thank you.
I think it'd be fine.
Ms. Slotkin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks for being here. I know we're about to start hour 3 of this hearing, and I want to associate myself with the comments, the respectful comments on both sides of the aisle for those who made it, and apologize for those who aren't respectful as you come up here for these hearings. I think that there's a lot of the issues that are affecting the average American, particularly around prices and budgets and supply chains, are now we're seeing really affect the U.S. military. So my questions are going to focus mostly on that. And Mr. McCord, I'm going to give you a chance to get in the game here. First and foremost, actually, I'll start with Secretary Austin on supply chains, right? I represent a district that has 2 GM factories. One has been off and on dormant for the past year because we can't get a 14-cent microchip. Myself and Congressman Gallagher led a task force on DOD and sort of highlighting the issues on supply chains that the department had. You know, you picked up the rug on some of our supply chains at the Defense Department. There was a lot of creepy crawlies under there, a lot of dependencies on places like China that even for our U.S. military we still had. Can you tell us, we had some prescriptions in the last NDAA, but help give us some comfort that, like our private sector companies, DOD is actually kind of getting in the game and looking at this as a vulnerability?
We are in the game. As you know, it's been and is an area of emphasis for the president and for the government at large. So DOD is doing its part. This is especially important to us as we look at components of our critical weapon systems that use microchips, that use critical materials, strategic materials. We want to make sure that we are not vulnerable to.
Right.
To
Right, because I think the thing that while a GM plant can shut down, the U.S. military doesn't have that privilege of being able to shut down and just taking an economic hit. It's the protection of the country. Mr. McCord, on the budget, we've had a lot of discussion here about whether the proposed president's budget keeps up with the rate of inflation. And you said that you crafted the budget with a 4% inflation rate. We know that has largely gone up. I know that, frankly, on a bipartisan basis, people are interested in at least making sure that the department is keeping pace with inflation. Would you be willing to consider coming back to us and keying the budget to the rate of inflation? Very short, yes or no?
Congressman, yes. I think we're going to need to work with the committees, I believe, going forward to look at what's actually happening on the ground. And we had, as the Secretary said, we had to snap the chalk line at some point. To finish a budget, you have to make some assumptions and then move on. And
Sure.
we normally revisit our own situation internally, which generates reprogrammings that we send to you. We'll do that as soon as possible this year as well.
And I think there's nowhere that's more clear where inflation is really kind of a punch in the gut, at least in a district like mine where people drive 40 miles one way to work. It's the price of gas. And as I see it, the Department of Defense is one of the biggest consumers, maybe in the world, of gasoline. And I think you noted it was about $12 billion we spend a year on gas. What, if anything, has the Department of Defense done advocating with the White House to do more to try and affect the price of gas?
Congressman, as you say, we consume a lot of gas, but we are small compared to the market. We cannot drive the market by ourselves as 1% of the market. We're about 15% of the jet fuel market, so we are a significant player there. But we are ultimately at the mercy of the markets the way most other entities are. And our budget was done before Putin's invasion Ukraine spiked oil prices. Of course, that spike may come down slowly, may come down quickly. That's one of the many variables out there. But we are going to have to adjust for that going forward.
Okay, I would just say, as one of the biggest consumers, at least in the United States, of gas, that your voice in the conversation on doing more to try and lower the prices of gas would be helpful. Lastly, Mr. McCord, we passed on a bipartisan basis an amendment in the last year's NDAA that helps to try and examine the amount of pork, and I mean congressional pork, that is in the Department of Defense budget. The things that you all have tried to kill, the legacy weapon systems that you don't want anymore, the facilities you've tried to shut down. That amendment required a report. What is your assessment? I mean, I know the report isn't done yet, of what percentage of the department budget are things that the U.S. Congress has required you to provide?
Congressman, again, the report's not done, but I think in most years it averages in the 3 to 5% range. So it's not overwhelming, but it's significant.
And the rest of this we'll have to take for the record. The gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Waltz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Austin, a year ago, the rise of extremism, particularly white supremacy within the military, within our ranks, was a top priority for you. In fact, it was your first memo. Yet the department released a study this year, a year later, showing that 100 members of the military participated in some type of extremism. That's 100 out of 2.5 million. By my math, that shows that 99.996% of our military members have not participated in any form of extremism. So with that data, now being data-driven, is that still a top priority for you, or can we move on?
Yeah, you made a couple of points here, and let me say that my top priority is defending this country. Yep. It has been, and it will always be. On the issue of the percentages of people that are participating in extremist activities, you've heard me say that 99.9% of our people are doing the right thing every day, and I'm proud of them for what they do. But a small percentage of people can have an outsized impact on our
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Forgive me, I have a few questions. I think we have to be very careful. We're also seeing in polling a record drop in public confidence in the United States military. So I think we have to be very careful about narratives. We even had a hearing here in this committee on the rising tide of white supremacy within our military, and keep those narratives data-driven. So I appreciate 99.996%. One is too many, absolutely, and we always have to be vigilant, but we have to be careful about our narratives. I need to move on. Chairman Milley, we are absolutely providing more sophisticated equipment now to the Ukrainians. Counter-battery radar, my understanding, Puma UAVs in the latest package. Finally, I would argue that this is belated. They should have had it last year. But we do have it in train. My concern is that the NATO commander, General Walters, testified that as a policy matter, we're not conducting any training on this new equipment. So my question is, why not?
We're not conducting training in Ukraine.
We're not conducting training in Poland, outside of Ukraine. That's what he testified. There's literally a handoff.
Let me dig into that. And
maybe a quick verbal.
Yeah.
And so my question is, you know that the training on this equipment is critical.
I think you said we were not conducting training in Poland. But as you rightly point out, some of this gear does require training.
Okay, then that drives my question. Then are we training the Ukrainians outside of Ukraine in any location?
To use some of the gear, they have to have training, and we're doing that. So.
Yeah, great. That's fantastic, and thank you for clarifying that.
Of being trained right here in the United States in our school system.
So the Ukrainians are sending military, their soldiers off, and we're trained, not IMET or,
IMET is what I was talking about.
On the counter battery, on the latest variants, on the things that we're providing, we're training them how to use it.
And you can take advantage of the Ukrainians that are already here to leverage them as well.
Fantastic. On the Switchblade 600 variant, your Assistant Secretary for ISA testified last week that there's a memo on your desk, Mr. Secretary, to give it the correct procurement authorities that we need, or the designation to get that thing moving. Are we cleared up there? Can we move that?
The Switchblade 600 and 300 will move as quickly as they possibly can.
Okay. General Walters also testified that the Ukrainians would have been more effective if they had had Stingers pre-invasion. They had had them on day one, trained up, ready to go. General Milley, do you disagree?
Well, I think their air defense system, the larger air defense, the SAMs, the S-300s, Stingers for the man pads, and all the other varieties that the European countries have, the more that they had prior to the invasion, the better off they would have been. But I would caveat this. Russia has not, even today, established air superiority, and that's because of the effective use of man pads and their S-300.
Absolutely. But you wouldn't disagree
More
that
would
they
have
could
been
have
better.
been, more would have been better.
100%.
And I do think there's a lot of parallels, Mr. Secretary,
Sure.
to our approach to Taiwan. I respectfully disagree with you there. There are a lot of parallels, and there are a lot of things we should be learning. The effectiveness of sanctions as a deterrent and giving them the weapon systems they need pre-invasion, not having a tough response, a robust response post-invasion. Final question, General Milley, is the IRGC a terrorist organization, and should it remain so? Your best military advice.
You'll have to take that one for the record because the gentleman's out of time.
Thank you,
Ms.
Mr.
Houlihan is recognized for 5 minutes. Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Austin, General Milley, and Mr. McCord for appearing before us today. I very much appreciate the challenging times that you and the department are in right now as we are facing and watching the horrific events of the war in Ukraine unfold. I also know that the department's budget request this year is focused largely on modernization and transformation of the force. And in your written testimonies, you have mentioned how the department has to modernize and divest from legacy platforms that may no longer meet the needs of the force right now here in this country. President Zelensky has repeatedly called on the United States to transfer aircraft and other weapon systems to Ukraine, and so here we potentially have supply with a known demand. Is there anything that is preventing the Department of Defense from transferring legacy weapon systems, and I'll just give an example as the A-10, and other excess defense articles to Ukraine? Or are there any things that are preventing us for preventing the training for those? Is there any additional authority that you need to be able to expedite or approve transferring of weapon systems to Ukraine? Secretary Austin.
At this point, there are no additional authorities that we need, and certainly if we need additional authorities, we won't hesitate to come ask you for them.
Thank you. And with my next question, as we do identify weapons and systems that we can or are interested in divesting in, is there a process by which we can conduct due diligence to identify possible items for transfer to Ukraine, or to Mr. Waltz's point, to be more thoughtful about the future of other possible conflicts?
It'll be based upon their request and our assessment of what we have available. Also, the threat in the environment plays a big part of this. The ability to maintain the capability that we give them is also very, very important, and the ability to train on those on that equipment is also key.
And so using as the A-10 is just an example, and knowing that we originally anticipated that this war would be a matter of days and hours rather than now months and possibly years, using that A-10 as an example, is there a possibility of what is the department planned for the 21 A-10s that are in the plan right now to divest from Fort Wayne, and what is the condition of those aircraft?
Yeah, again, it's not just exporting the A-10.
Sure.
It's also whether or not that aircraft can survive in that environment, which is a key issue. And then number two, whether or not they can sustain the aircraft once we provide it to them. It is completely different, as you know, from any platform that they have or currently using. And so this is a big step. And then training the pilots. It's not a matter of days. This is a matter of months.
Yes. Yes, sir. And I actually have done some investigation, and I think that we're on the same page, that our understanding is on the order of magnitude of a couple of months. And I know the anticipation was that this would not last that long, but it's clear that it might still. And again, the A-10 is just an example of something that we might be looking into. And with the remainder of my time, we are now in the 5th week with no apparent end, and we need to make sure that we're coming to terms with the fact that this could be longer than we anticipated. I'm interested in the planned reduction of end strength across the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. The Navy, as we know, is already short of personnel in sea duty billets. The Air Force is suffering from a critical shortage of pilots. How does the department forecasting and planning for this prolonged war in Ukraine? Maybe General Milley, we could ask you that particular question.
Well, first, we are not directly engaged in combat operations in Ukraine. We are conducting deterrence and assurance operations in the periphery countries, the Article 5, NATO Article 5 countries. Having said that, in terms of the end strengths and the modest reductions in end strengths of each of the services, what the services have opted to do is reduce end strength a little bit in order to recoup savings, in order to modernize the force, aiming towards a 2030 timeframe, 2030 plus. And that's where you see these modest reductions in end strength. And that's, I mean, what they're trying to do is focus on China and Russia secondarily as the two principal threats in order to modernize and upgrade their force.
Yeah, and I think where my interest is that my understanding is that we haven't accounted for what might be a continued and increased presence in Europe in our force reduction planning.
Yeah, the force posture, the long-term force posture in Europe is yet to be decided. It's under debate right now. It's under review. NATO plays a big part in that, and General Walters will be making his recommendations as Secretary on that. But clearly, because of the war in Ukraine, there's at least a possibility, if not a probability, of an increased force presence over a lengthy period of time. That doesn't have to be stationing. That can be rotational. It can be a lot of different ways.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Mr. Johnson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, we need to understand the recruiting and retention challenges that the Department of Defense faces this year, and I'm not sure if all the answers provided thus far have clarified it yet. So have a couple questions on that. The Army's decided to cut active duty strength by 12,000 soldiers in fiscal year 23. Undersecretary Gabe Camarillo said last week, he said, quote, like every other employer in the economy, we're facing some challenging conditions in terms of our ability to recruit and attract talent. Given the particular conditions of a very tight labor market, our ability to meet all of our projected recruiting goals were a little bit challenged, unquote. Do you agree with Secretary Camarillo's assessment that it's the tight labor market that's the primary driver of recruitment challenges, at least for the Army?
Thanks, Congressman. I think actually there are a number of things that go into this equation. The fact that unemployment is below 4% is a key issue. But also, if you take a look at the impact of COVID over the last couple of years, as you know, our recruiters recruit a lot of kids out of high school, and those high schools have been in session on an infrequent basis in terms of actual physical presence there. So it's made things more complicated. Chairman mentioned a smaller population to recruit from. So as we combine all of those things, then there are headwinds, and it will be there will be headwinds for all of the services going forward.
I think that's true, but I want to acknowledge here that the objective facts, if we review the objective facts, I think the largest headwind is inescapably the reaction that DOD took to COVID. Let me provide some stats. 2 years ago, right before the pandemic struck, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world. There were recruitment challenges, there have been for many years, but we didn't have the budget request proposing to cut 12,000 soldiers from the Army like this year's budget asked. So what's changed over the last 24 months? It's the department's COVID vaccine mandate, and there's just no way around it. I mean, some have alluded to it already today, but requiring young men and women to take the vaccine has disqualified a huge portion of the population from military service. And here's some proof. Nationwide, more than 40% of males aged 18 to 24 have chosen not to become fully vaccinated, and as a result, they're now ineligible to join the military, right? Off the bat, that's 40% of the target demographic that's immediately ineligible to serve. I mean, this is just a fact. In the southeast portion of the country, where I'm from, that number is even greater. According to CDC, 52% of 18 to 24-year-old men in that region have chosen not to receive the vaccine. So why does that specific geographic region matter so much? What makes the Southeast important is that according to Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, southern states produced nearly 47% of military enlistments in 2019. That's Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, Virginia, Missouri, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas. Fertile ground for DOD recruiters. But these states send their sons and daughters to serve the nation at drastically higher rates than other states do. They contain only 38% of 18 to 24-year-olds in America, but they account for nearly half of all the enlistments. So I understand what's being said about the tight labor market and the inability to meet fitness standards and all the rest, but it's pretty plain, if we look at this, that DOD is having a recruiting and retention crisis because it has disqualified over half of the male population from serving in the military in its best recruiting grounds, and nearly 40% of men and women aged 18 to 24 nationwide. And then we're adding fuel to the crisis because There's this charade about the religious exemption process for service members, and I believe it's blatantly unconstitutional. Let me ask you quickly in the time that remains, in light of the obvious impact on recruitment and retention, does the department have any plans to repeal or modify the current COVID vaccine requirement?
I do not.
Let me ask you if you can tell us how many religious exemptions to the COVID vaccine have been granted across all services. And I'll note that in February, 15 exemptions were granted out of 16,000 applications.
Okay, I'm going to take that question and other COVID questions for the record. As you know, this is an issue in litigation, and so I'll take your questions for the record.
Well, in the 40 seconds I have remaining, I'll just state the obvious, what a lot of people back home are asking me and asking all of us, and that is, if it's so obvious that a vaccine mandate is causing this deficit in the number of troops, then why don't we just change it? I mean, COVID seems to be behind us.
I certainly disagree with your premise.
Well, I know you do, but I mean, obviously it's having a direct effect on our numbers of recruitment and retention and readiness, which is of great concern to all of us. And I know you're not going to change your mind here today, but I'm registering the concern of my district and many millions of Americans that we represent who share this opinion, and I hope that you'll take it under advisement. I yield back.